This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest, Martin Popoff, author of Driven, Rush in the 90s and in the End. The conclusion to the definitive biography of the rock and roll kings of the North, Rush in the 90s, includes 2 full-color photo inserts with unearthed photos of the band. In this conclusion to his trilogy of authoritative books on Canada's most beloved and successful rock band, Martin Popoff takes us through 3 decades of life at the top for Rush's Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart. Though this era begins with a brisk-selling Roll the Bones and sees throngs of fans sell out international tours, there is also unimaginable tragedy, with Peart losing his daughter and his wife within the space of 10 months, and 2 decades later, succumbing to cancer himself. In between, however, there is a gorgeous and heartbreaking album of reflection and bereavement, as well as a triumphant trip to Brazil, a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, and, some say surprisingly, the band's first full-blown concept album to close an immense career marked by integrity and idealism. And here to talk about the book is Martin Popoff. To hear the songs discussed in this episode, check out the show notes page. Martin, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Yes, thanks for having me, Eric. Very cool.
So this is a new podcast. I've had you on about a handful of times for the last podcast, Discovery. For the new podcast listeners, tell us about yourself, where you're from, what got you into rock and roll, and ultimately what got you into writing about rock and roll music.
Well, I'm currently living in Toronto. Well, been here a long, long time, but from British Columbia originally, just a small town. Was just a crazy rock fan since, I would say, 6, 7 years old. And quite woke and becoming an expert, I would say, by about 10 years old, 10, 11 years old. So 73, 74, that's when the heavy stuff was getting discovered. Your Nazareth, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Kiss in 74, and Rush in 74. And, there's Deep Purple and Black Sabbath and all that stuff. So got a Circus subscription and was down at the local bookstore buying Cream and Hit Parader the whole time. And the new wave of British heavy metal came around. So definitely pretty much this was a big hobby of mine by 15, 16, 17 years old. Did a BA, did an MBA, worked for Xerox, had a desktop publishing print broking business with a partner for about 9 years. But along the way, met Tim Henderson, 1994. We started Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles together. He's the boss of it, and he's still doing bravewords.com. Big high traffic site, but we ran a print magazine for a while. But starting in 94, that's when I got to interview lots and lots of bands. I had already done the self-published book of record reviews, but this is where it ramps up. And then in 2000, my partner, who was from South Africa, moves to New Zealand, and we sell the business, and I go full-time into this in the year 2000. So it's been 21 years full-time, and 108 books later, and lots of record reviews, and those record review books, of course, as well, and possibly more record reviews than anybody's ever written in the history of mankind, at around 8,000 of those, but I don't do them anymore, so someone's going to beat me soon. But yeah, so just my main job now, with the changes in the industry and with magazines more or less going away and stuff, is the books. So that's why it looks like I can get a lot of stuff out, but I think anybody in my position could probably get a lot out if it was their full-time job. So there you go.
Do you have any favorite writers growing up that you particularly followed or looked to for inspiration?
No, never paid any attention to that. Never had any clue that I would be writing about any of this. I mean, I did my self-published record review book, the first book I ever did when I was 30 years old. So I had no industry ties, no thoughts of ever doing any of this. So just adored to death. And I can picture the pages in my head, your Cream and Circus and Hit Parader and Kerrang and Sounds and Metal Forces and all that stuff, but paid zero attention to the bylines, who was writing anything.
So it's kind of like a musician who doesn't really listen to a whole lot of other music. They kind of do their own thing. You came up with your own style.
Well, or a musician, which, this doesn't happen out in the world, a musician who listens to a ton of music, but has no clue who did it.
Yeah, that's better description.
Yeah.
So the book industry, has it gotten better, worse, just different? Because people, the way they can access books now, there's a whole lot more ways they can do it.
I don't think it's changed nearly as radically, well, it hasn't, as the music industry, because, in terms of the actual product itself, print books have more or less had a new thing added that sells about 10% or 20% max of all the books out there, which is the ebooks. Other than that, there's been no real changes. I would say the biggest change would be how quick and accessible and amazing, and the quantity and the quality and everything of all the free reading you would want to do just by looking at your phone or your computer. So that's changed. Just like in the music business, essentially, they're always grousing that music is essentially free now. That's not quite the same for books, but frankly, I got a book on Rainbow out. If you're really curious about Rainbow, you could just go on the internet and read and read and read to your heart's content. And at the end of a month or two, you'll have read 2 to 3 times the amount of stuff that's in my book. It won't exactly be my book, and it'll be all in all little bits and pieces, but still, for any level of fan, if you want to satisfy your curiosity by reading about that band, you could do it on the internet. You don't have to get the book.
Yeah, it's more of a personal connection. I think it's just like somebody owning an actual album, cassette, CD. Back in the day, you feel a personal connection to actually having the book. There are people that still prefer, I want the physical book. I don't want to read it any other way.
It is that, but it is also the fact that it is a book, that it goes from start to finish, and it is that 30 or 40 or 50 hour experience where everything's there. It's almost as accessible as the internet in terms of finding your place in the chapters and all that stuff. So, and it's also a time away from the screen. That's an important thing as well. So it's good for your brain and your eyes to just not be looking at a screen all the time.
And how does Kindle change things? Because I have Kindle, so it costs less to get a book through that way. Do you take a hit as the writer, almost like an artist when somebody streams a song? How does that all play out financially for the author?
The whole ebook situation, it literally is quite a different product. But of course, you get paid less for an ebook. There is, just like CDs, there's not the plastic and paper being driven around by trucks and stuff. So generally, an ebook of a full-length book is around $10. A print book is maybe $25 or something like that. So you definitely make less. But when I'm talking about, when I do a lot of a big chunk of my income is the mail order of my own books, whether that's through a publisher or any of my self-published titles. I'm buying copies of the books to sell. There is a bit of work in handling that and signing it, packing it up, and sending it off. When I get paid for ebooks, I don't have to do any extra work at all. I just literally receive the money, either through the traditional means of a publisher and it's part of your royalties, or I've got my ebook situation with my buddy and my company that I deal with here in Toronto, where at the end of the month, I just get a PayPal of the amount that I'm owed. So yeah, you will make less on it, but it is less for everybody to sell. Just the same way when downloads of CDs came out, they were $10 rather than $16. And now with streaming, it's a whole different model. It's $10 a month, right?
And for somebody who is listening to this right now, who's an aspiring writer, and they want to write a book one day, and you're someone who has, like I say, over 100 books, 108 and counting, and they don't know where to start or where to begin. What advice do you have for somebody who's just getting started in this and they want to put out a book someday?
Well, obviously, you have to have something to say. So in the nonfiction world, you become an expert in something that you really want to write about, that you've picked up by osmosis all your life and you enjoy it. So you have to want to do it. And it helps to have a burning subject that you're an expert on to go out and write that book. Now, that's not the case all the time. I mean, a lot of writers will just pick a topic as they move along, famous writers, if they've already got like a publisher set up or whatever, and hey, it's time to write a new book. They'll go out and research something, and it'll be like it was for all of us in school. Just go out and do your book report, right? Only it's longer. But other than that, obviously, you could get a publisher. You could self-publish it. Fiction is a whole world I don't know anything about, really. But, I mean, you could go out and write a book. But I would suggest going out and get serious about actually getting it written first and wading in and seeing how much work it is. Because a lot of people who think they want to write a book find out it's way more work than they thought it was. And they aren't as fast a writer as they thought they were, and it just bogs right down. So it's almost like don't put the cart before the horse. At least get in there and get 10 or 20% of it done and see what you think of the experience.
Just like anything creative, you got to love it. And this leads right into the topic of this episode, which is rush. But I guess the challenge is with so many books that have been written out there about all these bands, should you avoid getting caught up in looking for a different angle? Because there's so many books out there on particular bands. So do you say to yourself, well, that's already been written, so I'm not going to do that? Or do you just say, just go for it? If it's already been written about, still go for it. Write about that album and do it your own way.
Yeah, no, I certainly, my enthusiasm for writing a book on a band goes down if it's already been done and it's already been a good job or a big, thick book. I don't even care how good a job is. If it's a big, massive book and it's boring as hell, but everything's in there, that still is enough to make me kind of not want to do it in most cases. And then for big, huge, famous bands, I've found over the years that books on the big, huge, famous bands where there are a lot of books on them already, it's not like there's room for one more. Generally, the books I've done on the biggest bands are not my bestsellers. My bestsellers are books on Blue Oyster Cult and Max Webster and Accept and Riot and Montrose and Merciful Fate. The Merciful Fate book is in friggin' 5 languages now. It's crazy. I've just recently done a book on Angel and Sweet, and both of those have done pretty well. So I find that the fans out there, that generally the books on the more obscure bands will do better than a book on Metallica or Pink Floyd or AC/DC.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So this is the last of a 3-part across the decade series on Rush. Anthem, Rush in the 70s. Limelight, Rush in the 80s before this one. How does it feel to have completed this series? Quite a bit of time put in, I would imagine. And as you write in the introduction, Neil Peart passed away just as you had completed the first and second books. Is this bittersweet?
Yeah. And literally, I mean, this book had also been finished for something like a year before Neil passed. So we had to go in and I had to change the introduction. I changed a little bit towards the end. I on purpose didn't want to dwell on it too much because I wanted the story of him to remain a happy story and not dwell on too much of the misfortune of here he is dying and not getting to enjoy his retirement and all that. But yeah, it was good getting all of this finished. I don't really think it felt like 3 separate books, having to write 3 separate books, because when I first got this deal, I kind of knew in the back of my mind it was going to be more than one book. But the first idea from the publisher was, let's just write the be all and end all, the kitchen sink of Rush books. But when I quickly started laying out all the interview quotes all over the place, I realized that it was coming in at like 360,000 words or whatever, which is perfect. What's actually perfect for 3 long books, which these kind of are. I guess they're pretty long, but way more than one book. I wrote it more or less all at once in one big long stream. And like I say, I was finished probably a year and a half, 2 years ago at this point now.
You've written many books on Rush. How would you describe the role Rush has played in your life as a music fan?
No more than any other band, really, except that it did turn out they wrote a lot of books on them. The previous 3 Rush books are all very different from these 3, and I didn't think I would do any more as I went along. But because it is so different, it has a whole different purpose than the other ones. There's no real overlap with the old ones, other than a slight overlap with the very, very first one, which is with the same publisher, ECW Press. But no, Rush was just another one of these bands. I've been asked this many times, but I can't remember if I was right there with the debut album in 74. Probably was, but certainly was around by 75. So they've been there all my conscious rock and roll life and getting every album as a new release. And it is cool that they're a Canadian band. They're our like biggest, proudest moment of Canadian bands. I don't think they're my favorite Canadian band. I think that would be Max Webster. But still, yeah, Rush has been there all the time, all along. And I suppose I had one extra little thing that a lot of musicians can claim. I mean, I was a drummer as well. I haven't done it recently, but I was a drummer, and Rush is that perfect woodshedding band where you put on the headphones and you turn it up loud and you play behind it, right? Whether it's bass or guitar or drums. And for me, it was drums, the big, huge drum set with the tune toms and the whole bit. So that was a big thing with Rush and me as well, just learning those albums in the late 70s, early 80s.
We talk Rush in the 90s in this book, and Neil Peart, again, the main lyricist during this period. And for you, the decade starts off on a down note with Roll the Bones in 1991. You write Neil Peart's inspiration for the title was a Fritz Leiber sci-fi story called Gonna Roll the Bones, which he had read back in the 70s. No direct influence of the story on Peart's concept or lyrics, but I guess Neil had liked the phrase, so he jotted it down for future reference. Although it's released in the 90s, it's more of an 80s record, specifically compared to 1989's Presto. A thin production doesn't help either.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a brother-sister record with Presto. I think Rush has a lot of these little paired situations. Power Windows, Hold Your Fire. I would say Caress of Steel, 2112. So they got a lot of records that kind of pair up with each other. And I think these pair up. It just happens that one comes in the previous book and one comes in this book. But they're pretty similar to each other with the Rupert Hine production as well. That's the other thing they did. They worked with producers a couple times in a row, whatever, and then moved on or whatever, although Peter Collins comes back. But after this, they make a fairly different record in counterparts as they move on. So yeah, this is the longest of the books. It covers the longest period, but the band themselves work less. They become such Renaissance men and into so many different things including their family lives, but a lot of hobbies as well, that the touring spreads out and the records spread out throughout the course of this last book.
Roll the Bones, a lot of vocal melodies, right? They're focusing on the melodies on that one.
And Geddy always does talk about, he has this narrative that these are the singing albums, right? He's always said that about Presto, and he really defends that album as being all about singing. Vocal melodies is a really funny thing to talk about, and not a lot of people talk about it enough. It's a kind of an interesting topic. I should do a topic of my podcast on vocal melodies. It is a funny, esoteric topic, isn't it? I guess the definition of it, and people don't really define it much or talk about who's really good at it or who's not good at it by trend. But I guess the definition of it is kind of a deliberate or structured melody that you set against the guitar riff or what everything else is doing. And I guess it's a melody within the song. It's an added melody within the other melodies within the song. And I guess when people say something has a good vocal melody, it's one that is kind of non-obvious against what the guitar was doing and maybe adds to it a lot and maybe seems more deliberate because the next time the verse comes around, they do it again. And the more complicated, I suppose, the better in terms of the doing it again and seeing it as a deliberate thing. So those are the guys that people talk about as having good vocal melodies. And I've never really had that question answered or asked. Who is really good at vocal melodies and who isn't, right?
History in 5 songs, by the way. Free plug. We're going to get the History in 5 Songs podcast. That's what you're talking about.
I do a podcast called History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, and I just did the 100th episode. And this sounds like a good one to do an episode on, but it also sounds like a lot of homework. But it's funny. I guess the only time I ever hear anybody say bad vocal melodies is they always cite the example of Ozzy Osbourne and Iron Man. Because when you follow the riff exactly, that's considered, oh, you have no imagination. You didn't think about this much. You did a bad vocal melody, right? But Ozzy has also a lot of good vocal melodies too. So
Ozzy's interesting because is he the only guy out there who's solely done his own harmonies? He layers his voice on top of his own voice.
No, a lot of people, I believe in Judas Priest, Rob Halford, if there are harmonies or where there are harmonies, apparently that's just Rob with himself. I think I've heard that before. But there's another interesting episode of something. Who does the harmonies only with themselves and who does it with other members of the band and whatnot?
Just an article stands out to me reading about Ozzy talking about that. He says, I've always done my own harmonies. Always.
Yeah. The only other singer in the band is Bill. So,
right.
Van
Halen, A Different Kind of Truth in 2012. That's the first time I think ever that David Lee was layering his own vocals with his own voice. If you listen to that album, he's doing it there.
You're the expert. I mean, famously, Mikey is considered this great harmony guy. But what about the rest of the Van Halen albums? Is Dave not even in on the harmonies?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Actually, Greg Prato was asking me about that too.
I bet Ed would have been too, probably, right?
Yeah, Ed and Mike together. Like I told Greg Prato, that's the sweet spot with Ed and Mike together. But then sometimes it was all three of them. And sometimes it was Dave and Mike. I don't think it was ever Dave and Ed. I'm trying to think. In the Sammy years, I think in Humans Being, I think Ed's singing underneath Sammy on that song. But on 2012's A Different Kind of Truth, without Michael Anthony there, you could tell that Dave's doing his own harmonies.
And it's interesting, Eric, because, a lot of these things, because I'm writing some stuff now that's so inside baseball. Well, I'll tell you what I'm doing. I haven't said this anywhere else, but I'm writing a book where I'm analyzing every single song by The Dam.
Oh.
I did a Clash book like that, and I did a Led Zeppelin book like that. And it's really quite a satisfying intellectual academic exercise. But anyways, the point is that there are so many things like this one we just talked about that are not in the credits. You can't sort this stuff out by credits. So you have to be like a super fan or an expert like yourself on Van Halen to have read it in an article somewhere, otherwise, or heard an interview. You can only pick up this knowledge or have your ear so attuned that you can tell. So those are the only two ways you're going to find out who's doing the harmonies, right?
Yeah, it took me a long time to figure out that I was in the minority. So I'd start talking about that stuff with the average music fan and their eyes glaze over. What the hell's he talking about? Yeah. Getting back to Rush, Neil's rap in the middle of Roll the Bones. That got the attention of Rush fans. This comes at a time when that rap rock thing is starting to become trendy. The Anthrax song with Public Enemy, Bring the Noise. Of course, Run DMC, Aerosmith song, Walk This Way. That was about handful of years before. That was the catalyst. I remember hearing Kip Winger rapping on a song from their second album, which came out just before Roll the Bones. And I had to look it up because I forgot the title. Baptized by Fire. Kip Winger rapping. So you quote Geddy Lee in your book. He said, at that time, it was kind of the beginning of rap and hip hop and all this. And Neil wrote this really funny kind of piss take on this whole thing. And we thought, why don't we throw it in that song? And that's how that whole middle section of Roll the Bones came to be. It was just us having fun playing this goofy background kind of rhythmic track and then rapping on it. Were you surprised to hear that part from Neil? Rapping?
Yeah, I mean, they obviously have a sense of humor. I mean, this is a big difference from Anthrax or Aerosmith, really. This is, like Geddy says, it's just like a silly thing we threw in there or whatever. But the funny thing about it is any publicity is good publicity. They got a lot of heck for that, but the fact of the matter is Roll the Bones going platinum, reversing this trend that their records plateaued at gold in the States. This one goes platinum, and I swear a good chunk of that is just the extra press they got out of that thing.
I thought it was good. I didn't even know it was Neil Peart, but I thought he did a good job. At the end, get out there and rock and roll the bones. And it goes right into the guitar solo. But they never took themselves too seriously. So that quote pretty much says it all. They didn't overthink it. It was just like, what the hell? Put it in there.
Exactly.
Their producer, Rupert Hine, talked about the influence David Bowie had on Rush's decisions to take chances. With each album, he risked losing half his fans, but more often than not picked up the same amount of new fans.
Yeah, it's true. And, you have heard fans say that, and it does happen. I think more often than not, if you take a chance and do something pretty strange, you're going to lose more fans than you're going to gain. I think that's sort of a given. I think in most cases, it's going to go more bad than good, I suppose. But with Rush, I don't think even that's really their concern. I mean, they're just so intellectually curious and moving forward all the time and wanting to try something new and restless to try something new, that's what they're going to do. So they were changing. Sometimes they changed with the times, and sometimes they changed almost like they were just trying to do something that was against the times and was something different for different sake. And I think sometimes when you make something different for different sake, it doesn't normally turn out so well. But it is funny. I mean, deep Rush fans will defend Rush and say, oh, they didn't follow trends. They followed lots of trends. But it's almost like if they followed a trend, it was sincere. I mean, they did it out of sincerity. They followed it because, whoa, that's exciting. That trend's cool. That's exciting. I want to do some of that. And it was never just for the money. Because there were always other trends they could have followed that probably would have paid off even better. New wave of British heavy metal, hair metal, rap rock, right? I mean, they could have done new metal. They could have done industrial. There were other trends. They could have done grunge. They didn't do any of those trends, but they did follow a few other trends like 80s production values and keyboards and electronic drums. They followed that one, but other ones they didn't follow. So
yeah, that's something you could never accuse Rush of, is trying to capitalize on a current sound just so they could become hip. That was never their thing. The three singles off of Roll the Bones, Dreamline, Ghost of a Chance, Bravado, they all did very well. Do you have a personal pick of those three? Oh, Roll the Bones, I'm sorry, too. Roll the Bones was the single,
Roll
too.
the Bones is actually a really catchy song because of all those little rhythmic switchbacks in them. But Dreamline's pretty cool, too. But Roll the Bones is the one that... Do you ever have those songs, Eric, where... I mean, and they could just be so random, but... I've got this collection of 20 song parts that just constantly pop into my head my whole life. I can't get them out of my head and for no reason. And some of them are literally things that they're off of albums I remember hearing 5 times back in 1985 or something. And it's there, like little rhythmic things or whatever. And Roll the Bones strikes me as one of those. Like I can always hear that intro arrangement.
Yeah, the riff from Alex Lifeson. Yeah, you keep hearing that old.
It's very catchy, right?
Sometimes
catchy
it's nice
in a complicated way.
Yeah, sometimes it's nice. Sometimes it drives you mad. Make it stop. They follow up Roll the Bones with Counterparts in 1993. That's during the height of the grunge rock era. Geddy said the band was moving into a jazzier, softer tonal area leading up to this album. He was happy to get back to the harder edge songs. And you, as a Rush fan, were happy to see that as well?
Yeah, and it's not that it's even that much harder edge. I mean, I think that narrative is a little simplified, how heavy that album is. I don't think it is that heavy. I think the main thing that everybody makes why they think it's heavy is because Stick It Out is super heavy. It's probably the heaviest song they did since the 70s. And that was an advanced single. So everybody got to sort of ponder that song for a month or two or whatever it was. And then Animate was the next flagship track on it. And that's probably the second heaviest track on the album, right? So when you've got those two songs just pounding in your head constantly, it makes you think the album is pretty heavy, but it's not that heavy. The nice thing about it, though, for sure that it is the bass and the bottom end are back. I don't think there's more guitars on it than the previous two. It's just that the guitars, it's a little more distortion pedal guitar, a little more of the low, mid, and bottom frequencies of the guitar, but there's certainly more. The drums are fatter. Everything about it, it just sounds better. You know, I often make the analogy that Presto and Roll the Bones, it sounds like a little wee Rush playing in a matchbox kind of thing, right?
Other singles on Counterparts are Cold Fire, Double Agent, and one of my favorite Rush songs, Nobody's Hero. The music and lyrics match up beautifully on that one. Neil was thinking of heroism when he wrote the lyrics.
Yeah, great song. You're right. I agree with you. And all those nice, big, bold acoustic guitars. Cold Fire's great too. And Cold Fire rocks out as well. So that's probably the third heaviest song on the album, right? There's three reasons to think that record is heavy. And then, you know, when these Rush guys get asked over and over and over again the same kind of questions and their answers get more trite and more succinct and more ossified in their brains, they perpetuate a lot of the myths about Rush too. So they probably perpetuate and forget some of the deep album tracks on it and say, oh yeah, we were back again. We were heavy again, right?
Nobody's Hero, very much in line with what Neil Peart would write about. Introspective, the internal conflict he had. He likened himself to famous athletes and actors who are sold and bought as being perfect, like demigods.
One thing that just came to me is that Nobody's Hero reminds me a little bit of Losing It, where you get multiple little vignettes to make the point, right?
One of my all-time favorite Rush songs, Losing It.
Me too. So that's kind of cool about that as well. But yeah, Neil, in the old days, he did lots and lots of interviews, and he was really good at it. But as time went on, he was the guy, obviously, who pulled away a little bit. When they'd have meet and greets and stuff, he wouldn't be there. It just rubbed him the wrong way, being told how great he was all the time, or compliments, or what a cool song that is. He was tongue-tied. He didn't know what the answer was. Yeah, it's a good song. You know, what are you going to say, right? He's also this kind of guy that doesn't suffer fools gladly. He wants the conversation to be substantive from both ends. And if it's not, or when it's not, I guess he gets annoyed, and I'd rather be reading a book, right?
Yeah, you have a great quote from him in the book. A role model is, to me, the opposite of a hero in a sense, or a counterpart, if you like, in the sense of the definition of counterpart is both duplicate and opposite. It's one of the reasons why I was intrigued by the word so much. So a role model is good because there's no aspect of deity or superhuman perfection about it. It's just, that's the direction I want to go. And here's a person doing it the way I'd like to do it. That's another great quote from Neil Peart. And one of the inspirations of the song was his friend who died of AIDS, someone who occupied a heroic space in his life for preventing him from being homophobic. He was pretty transparent about that.
Yeah, and the album didn't do that well out in the marketplace. It was another gold record for them or whatever. But at this point, it got into this funny zone with that and Test for Echo, where it almost wasn't about the record sales anymore. It was more like the show just kept getting bigger and bigger. And when they'd go on tour, there'd be tons of people showing up. So they just became, their business model was always different than other bands' business models. They just kept building that show and putting more and more money into it and being more high tech, that it was just a juggernaut, and it was almost irrelevant what was going to happen with the records. I mean, they were still a big, huge going concern.
Yeah, and around this time, Neil gets seriously into jazz drumming. Buddy Rich specifically, he takes instruction from jazz drum legend Freddie Gruber, who changed the way Neil approached his kit. He completely reinvents his drumming before they get to recording 1996's Test for Echo. Your thoughts on the album Test for Echo?
I was not a big fan of it. I was not huge into Rush at the time. I find it kind of a strange non-committal album. The production is weird. We're back to Peter Collins on that one. It's almost like, you know what it reminds me of, Eric? It reminds me of my recent kind of annoyance at the Cheap Trick Productions. There's just something synthetic and strange about the relationship between the guitars and the drums that just doesn't sound real. It sounds kind of plasticky. Like you don't know if there's nothing that sounds like vibrant and heavy and loud. Everything sounds kind of behaved, whether it's a rocking out song or not. And for some reason, Test for Echo strikes me that way as well. The big difference between those two being that Test for Echo is quite trebly and sizzling and distorted, while his Cheap Trick is missing treble somehow. But still, Test for Echo, what it seems to be missing is bottom end. It seems to have a lot of nice electricity to the guitars and sizzle to cymbals and hi-hats and things. But the snare sound and the true bottom end of it is just kind of strange. It doesn't sound as high fidelity to me as Counterparts did. It doesn't have an anchor to it in some way. And those songs, I mean, I've often said it sounds like those songs didn't really need to be written. They didn't really need to make an album at this point. It's almost like it was just sort of expected of them. And I was just not a big fan of that record.
I think Geddy was being pushed a little bit by Peter Collins, because you start with the interesting quote in that chapter on the album. Geddy, could you be more interesting? That gets your attention. That had to do with Peter Collins pushing Geddy in the studio.
Yeah, Peter Collins, I mean,
was he talking vocals? Was he talking on the bass?
I'm not sure, but the funny thing about him is that he comes to the band with this strange poppy English taste in music. He was definitely not all about what early Rush was about. So maybe they were being too Rush-like and he wanted them to step out. He doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who likes prog or particularly power trios. This could have been any number of things.
Is there a song you like on the album? Because I love Half the World. That's another Rush track. Gets you to think about the world and mankind. Great melody, nice balance of melodic and aggressive. And Alex Lifeson's...
I don't know.
The mandola? Alex Lifeson on the mandola.
Smarmy, kind of. I don't know. Something about it seems a little kumbaya or smarmy or look how smart we are. I mean, I like Test for Echo, I think, better, the song. Although it's got that strange chorus, the here we go, I don't know.
Driven was the single.
Driven is not bad. Yeah, Driven is not bad. No, I was into all sorts of other things at that time.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this.
Hey, hello, everybody. It's Monty Emelik, the Lone Store Manager, and you're listening to the Booked on Rock podcast with Eric Sinich.
We're back with more of the Booked on Rock podcast. We go into 2002 now, Vapor Trails. A lot happens in between those two albums. Neil's daughter and wife, they both passed within a 2-year period following the Test for Echo tour. How he was able to get back on his feet again is pretty amazing. He did it by embarking on a long, painful journey on his motorcycle to recenter himself. What do you think about when you look back at that period between those two albums?
They did talk about how Rush was essentially done because you couldn't go on without Neil. Not only is he the greatest drummer in the world, as Ray says, he's the lyricist of the band as well. And there's just 3 of them and they're good buddies. But I think the record that came out of that is a really interesting one. It always reminds me a little bit of my favorite period of King Crimson, that red, blue, yellow period of the early 80s. I love that stuff. And this album reminds me of this idea. It's a little complicated one that I've never been able to quite explain, but I feel Morrissey albums have this too. The idea of making a whole new kind of music that you can't even really describe exactly, but still using guitar, bass, and drums and vocals. So it's like using regular tools, but you come up with a new kind of music. And to me, Vapor Trails was like that. It was just this music made out of textures. It certainly wasn't progressive in the normal sense, but it was progressive in the Peter Gabriel, King Crimson sense, in the Robert Fripp sense, in that it sounded like something you'd never heard before. Yeah, and every song kind of went together in that respect, that they all, how odd, but also how deliberate it is that these songs all line up together and create this strange world that had nothing to do with previous Rush albums and nothing to do with anything after either.
Interesting you say that, because all 3 members wrote songs separately for this one, right?
But there was a lot of jamming and putting together stuff. It was a long labored process, but yeah, which is quite odd because it sounds way more unified than I think all the other ones. And like I say, it has this purpose, but it's this rarefied new language of music. Yet it's subtly different. if you want to go further down the subtly different, I brought up the idea of Morrissey. Whereas if a regular person would play a Morrissey album and not really think about this weird deep thought, but I hear it when I play Morrissey albums where it's like, well, what is this? Is this pop? Is it power pop? Is it hard rock? Is it, well, there's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. There's some ballads, but it's all bars and guitar, bass, and drums, and everything seems to be more or less conventionally verse, chorus, verse, and an intro. And yet I can't figure out what genre to put this in.
Yeah.
That's the funny thing about Morrissey's music. I can't put it in a genre at all.
I'm a big Cure guy. I like Morrissey and I like the Smiths, but I've always been a Cure guy. That was the big war back in the day.
Yeah, I've always owned everything by the Cure, but I've never, to me, they fit in that. I have this category of retirement bands, or they're a little bit like the Desert Island Band. If I was put on a desert island, I can only have one catalog to keep me. Something like the Cure would be a great catalog because I don't know it well enough, but I know I like it. And I've kind of owned most of it all my life, in and out or whatever, right? And it's always there, but it's almost like this is a band for future study.
Yeah, great band. One thing for sure as a fan, anytime Robert Smith says, we have a new album coming out, and this is when it'll probably come out, don't expect it to come out then. He's funny. Yeah. He's funny. He always.
What is their record recently? I mean, what are they broken up? I mean, I haven't heard anything.
He still has. He has a lineup that is fairly consistent with what it's been over the last 10, 15 years. And when they got into the Rock Hall, he said he wanted to get a new album out by Halloween, and I think that was 2 Halloweens ago. If not,
they're in the Rock Hall, are they?
Yeah.
They got actually inducted into the Rock Hall thing. That's great.
Oh yeah. Wow. They got in. They got in. So when they were getting a lot of
press
press around that time, they said, what's next? They said, well, we got one coming out. We're hoping to get it around Halloween. And
so when is the last studio album?
Oh, boy. That would have to be. Now. Yeah, that would have to be 2008, 413 Dream. 2008.
Okay, so 13 years ago.
Imagine that. 13 years. Back to Vapor Trails. Let's talk about the singles. One Little Victory. Secret Touch was also a single. Any singles that stand out for you on that album? I think really those
definitely
are the two.
Not Secret Touch. I mean, I do like One Little Victory. That was the advanced single, but my favorite is Vapor Trail. That is my favorite song on it. And I always think of that part later on where it goes, in a vapor trail. And then there's that big kind of dive bombing Alex Lifeson part. That's my favorite part of the whole album. There's a couple of other pretty radical songs late in the sequence too, but One Little Victory was the advanced single with that complicated drum intro thing. And that also is one that I think fulfills, it serves as a metaphor for this idea that I talked about, how it's a pretty strange sounding record of kind of a new language, or at least a new dialect.
And then they released the live album Rush in Rio, October of 2003. 2004, there's the covers EP Feedback, including a cover of Summertime Blues, which was released as a single, got some good airplay on radio. What do you think of the live album, and what do you think of the covers EP?
Well, the live album was really cool because that's that whole narrative of how Rush is not one of these world bands. They're not a Deep Purple or an Iron Maiden that is played everywhere in the world and loves touring the world. They like touring other countries individually, but they're not a band who did a lot of that. So I love that whole surprise and the buildup of them going there and how massive it was. So that was cool. The Feedback EP I thought was horrible. I thought it was just a terrible, terrible choice of songs. I went on the Rush Roundtable recently, and we were all asked to come up with our Feedback 2.0, like come up with your dream Feedback EP, right? Or the next one or something like that. I really thought you couldn't have picked a more unimaginative bunch of songs that aren't even all that great. And they're certainly not songs your fans want to hear, but that wasn't the point. I just thought all the choices were so uninspired, which is really weird coming from a super mentally active and creative band who invented progressive metal and then went and did all these different things. And then they do this incredibly conservative raft of songs for this EP. And then they further annoyed by having it be 8 tracks, so it's not exactly an EP and it's not exactly an LP. So we all have to waste parts of our lives calling it both.
What songs I'm curious now, what songs would you like to see them cover? More in the vein of like King Crimson type of stuff?
Well, I mean, if I can remember correctly, my Feedback 2.0 had Thin Lizzy Bad Reputation. It had UK in the Dead of Night. It had a No Means No song. It had Uriah Heep Magician's Birthday. It had UFO, Long Gone. It had Tea Party, The Tea Party, Bizarre, and it had Max Webster, Toronto Tontos. So that's what I would have liked.
So you would have preferred, and some bands will do this, they'll do a cover album and it's not the popular songs. It's just stuff that they love or deep tracks, things that might challenge them and the listener.
Yeah, except they did popular songs that aren't deep tracks, that they loved, that don't challenge anything.
Cover albums are tricky, I suppose. You could sometimes pull off the Jimi Hendrix covering All Along the Watchtower type of moment, but other than that, do you stay true to the original or do you try to make it your own? Do you try to do a little of both? They're hard.
Well, putting that aside, picking the songs, number one, the first band that actually picked them like their fans would have picked them was Iron Maiden. And then the second band that did that was Metallica. So those two bands, and then it became the covers thing was not a rare thing anymore. And there was nothing, all the magic was gone. Just like when Rush made a million live albums later, it's when the magic around live albums is gone. So you don't talk about them as much as you do All the World's a Stage or Exit Stage. Same with covers. But Maiden, I give credit as the band who picked really interesting choices. They were deep, they were obscure. They were songs that were kind of heavy from the heavy metal past, or there were songs that were from the prog past that they made heavier, or they picked a Skyhooks tune, Women in Uniform. So they were really imaginative and creative about it. And it turned into a useful bit of product that they probably liked, I'm sure, but their fans totally would dig as well. So that's the important part of the picking, I think. And that's why, my 2.0 is like, I'm sure if the Rush saw my 2.0, they would laugh. Just fall about the room laughing, right? It's like, That's ridiculous, right? And I had all these reasons. It's like you toured with these bands. Some of them are on your, out of the same office as you. Some of them are No Means No is the punk Rush, and they're legends, and they're from Victoria and Canadian, and other bands are bands you toured with. So that's why I picked UFO and Thin Lizzy and Your Eye Heap and blah, blah, blah. Right. And
Martin, you've written some great books on us, but we're not going to play those songs. We're not going to record those songs.
but the problem is in the old days. So they picked songs the way people picked songs in the 70s to cover. In the old days, you picked really boring, regular sort of songs, and you also indulged like, this is what I grew up on. And that's one of the problems with covering songs in general. People don't realize that the songs they grew up on, they were great for the time and you loved them because of the magic of the time. But the competitiveness of rockers through the years made those songs sound really simple and kind of boring. So if you weren't there at the time, it's not going to come off so great. So Summertime Blues is not going to really impress anybody. It was impressive when Eddie Cochran did it, and it was still kind of impressive when it was super souped up by Blue Cheer and The Who. But
The Who.
You doing it now, less souped up than even those two versions 30 years earlier. What's the point?
Well, they get back to the originals, 2007's Snakes and Arrows. Alex was inspired by seeing David Gilmour in concert. I did not know about this until reading your book. So he sees David Gilmour in concert, writes on acoustic guitar, even thanks David in the liner notes.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that I always kind of remember about that album the most, is that there does seem to be this mixing in of acoustic guitar with the electric in the tracks, which is somewhat of a novel thing. So that's the thing with Rush. All along the way, they did these novel things that were kind of subtle. And I get back to that Morrissey thing, where it's like it's hard to talk about what is strange about Morrissey, because you play any given song, it doesn't sound that strange, right? And so Rush is kind of like that. And Snakes and Arrows is a perfect example of that. It's like, there's no one else on the planet that would make an album like this or has ever made an album like this. It's just so weirdly the evolved version of these three guys. You can never have an album that sounds like this. And Rush albums throughout the years, that's one of the things you really got to give them credit for, is that there are really almost zero places along that spectrum, all along that whole catalog, where anybody else would dare try or did try make records that sounded a little bit like Rush. There was no little clump of a genre other than they invented progressive metal, but there was no one where you'd say these three bands sound like Rush.
You're right.
I mean, later on, you get a great band out of Detroit called Tiles. When there's tons and tons of progressive albums starting in the 90s, and there's tons of records, period, in every genre, yes, you can now start hearing certain things that you're playing to those influences. But yeah, all along the way, at any point in Rush's history, it's really hard to find any other records that you could say that sounds quite a bit like Rush.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah, there was no Kingdom Come Oh, those guys are Led Zeppelin or Greta Van Fleet's. That's a Rush ripoff. You're right about that.
It's literally only the very first album because it does fit into that Led Zeppelin, Bad Company, even Montrose, Kiss, Aerosmith range, where it's like with John Rutsey on drums. I mean, those songs were semi-conventionally written. I mean, Moxie and Triumph, even though that's much later, they don't sound a lot different than the first album. But starting with Caress of Steel, they're just off in a whole other world.
Yeah, if anything, Rush was lumped in with Zeppelin because people thought when the Cleveland radio station was playing Working Man, they thought it was Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
But nobody came out with a single and said, geez, I think that's Rush. Nobody ever said that. That's interesting. I never thought about that.
Yeah.
The song The Larger Bowl is an example of where the band was at that point, too. You got 3 singles, Far Cry, Spindrift, and The Larger Bowl. Neil comes up with the lyrics on The Larger Bowl during a bicycle trip in West Africa. The title came to him in a hallucinatory dream. He also saw women there carrying bowls on their heads. Track is highlighted by Alex's acoustic guitar, again, the David Gilmour influence. He was also inspired by seeing Australian guitarist Tommy Emmanuel play live. He did an acoustic set. Another was the English artist Stephen Bennett. Alex talked with him about the harp.
It just shows you that Alex is growing and learning still at this late stage, and he's listening to these obscure artists. He loves Adrian Belew as well. You know, Adrian Belew would come to town, and a buddy of mine, Andre, and he's buddies with Alex now too, and probably because of this link. But Adrian Belew would come to town, and Alex would want to go see him. So Alex would be lurking in the background watching Adrian Belew. So that's the other odd thing about Rush. Maybe they didn't get the chance. Maybe it's just not their favorite thing to do. But you really didn't hear them over the years talk lots and lots and lots about bands they liked, other than sort of the rote stuff about Cream and The Who and Yes and Genesis in the early years. But you never really hear them talk about a lot of this. And there is some neat stuff on the internet now where there's some recent interviews with Alex where he's talking about like Rory Gallagher and things like that, which is kind of cool. But, you know, they were big music fans. And you learn that when Eddie's Big Book of Bass came out and he's like meeting all these bass players that you didn't think he knew, like Doug Pinnick from King's X and all this stuff. And it's like, cool. But it's funny. You just never really heard them talk about these bands all that much.
You're right. Maybe their influences were artists and musicians that rock fans wouldn't recognize anyway. Maybe they were fans of more obscure stuff.
Yeah, I don't know how much they influenced them. Although, as you just said, I mean, Alex seemed to be inspired or influenced. But when it comes down to your Rush, you're one of the most unique bands in the world, and you're doing something quite unique that you haven't even done before, let alone other bands. And then you're only making an album every 5 or 10 years. It's not so much that you're going to see a ton of influences coming through.
Yeah.
This is not a band like cranking out albums every year over and over. So yeah, you don't really see the influence, but that whole thing you just read about Alex, I mean, that's just a great example of how the influences can be pretty insidious and unique and almost chimera-like.
You have to think that Alex and Geddy continue to get these kind of inspirational moments, which would lead to them working again. It doesn't have to be under the Rush name, but it would be great to see them work together again. Would you like to see them work together again under a different project?
They could, but it's almost like, I wonder if what goes through their mind is it's almost like when Page Plant got together, they said, well, we can't get John Paul Jones because it'll just be too much like Led Zeppelin or whatever. So you could almost see, I don't know if they're thinking this, but I could almost see them thinking it would be disrespectful to Neil for us two to work together again. And also, frankly, why bother? Like, why not just work with other people? You're so intellectually curious anyways. I honestly think those two guys would look at each other and go, and say it right to each other's faces, like, why would I want to work with you? You know, let's both have more fun and do something less predictable than that and just go work with other people.
Yeah, you're right. They seem more like that type of personality. Yeah, what's left for us to do together? Chapter 8, all about Rush's final album, Clockwork Angels. They released 2 songs ahead of the album, which I remember playing on the radio, getting very excited about what was to come. BUTB and Caravan. Neil's inspiration came from the likes of William Manchester's A World Lit Only by Fire, a treatise on the Middle Ages, along with John Barth's The Sackweed Factor and Voltaire's Candide. Man, that's some cerebral stuff.
Yeah, and they came out with, and then you get Kevin Anderson involved, and they came out with quite a complicated story that you need the book to even figure out what it's all about. So on record and reading those lyrics, you get pretty confused about how all this works. But the cool thing about the record is that Booge does a really nice job of bringing them out of their shell and getting them to groove a little better. I mean, the last album grooved as well, but this is where you really hear the fluidity out of Neil, where fluidity is one thing you didn't really associate with him too much. It was more pretty logical and locked down and studied and all that. But here you get that part of the heaviness, and you also get heavy low frequencies out of the bass and out of Alex as well. And you actually get, see, this is the funny thing about this record, that I kind of put it down a little bit. I mean, I was much more enthusiastic about it when it first came out, and I played it kind of less over time. But what I found about Rush when it came to the heavy stuff in later years is that it almost seemed like they had lost that heavy metal muscle that they barely had anyways, but they did have. They had it when heavy metal was still young, and they had it kind of across certain things on Fly By Night, Caress of Steel, 2112, most notably. So they had this heavy metal muscle, and they could write heavy metal with the best of them when they wanted to, which is rare. But they kind of lost the ability to write hard rock and heavy metal. And so when they went back and wrote a fair bit of it on Clockwork Angels, it came out as blundering and bluesy and brown and black and blue, and there's no real note dense riffs, and there's no real logic to it other than being caveman like. And so when you hear those heavy songs on Clockwork Angels, the riffs aren't very good, and it's not even really about riffs. It's kind of more about a Who-like performance.
Is it a concept album? Would you consider it
rather
to be
than
that?
a great riff? Oh, it's definitely a concept album, that's for sure. And it's the first one ever, right? Because people always thought they did concept albums. They did more like concept sides before, right? But this is definitely a concept album, and it does move in time. But the story is so complicated that it's hard to really pick up how it works. And the other nice thing about it not being a concept album is it's not broken up like other concept albums into like, here's the 30-second acoustic intro to the 10-minute song or whatever. Everything was a separate song, and they all sounded different from each other. And I don't think there's any recurring themes. So that's another conceptual thing you get with concept albums, right? In terms of like actual musical things that come back around. I don't think so. I don't think there's anything like that.
Yeah.
There's no reprise. There's definitely no named reprises or anything. I don't think anything does that either. But that is something you also get in concept albums that I never liked, actually, where it's like, oh, didn't we hear this, 5 tracks ago?
Yeah. An instrumental version of the first track on the album with lyrics.
Yeah.
Right. You brought up Kevin Anderson. Just for those who may not be aware, he's a sci-fi novelist, longtime friend of Neil. Novel came after the album. He wrote a novel based on it.
Yeah. Okay. I can't even remember how that worked exactly. And now he's doing a follow-up.
Really?
So
okay.
It's continuing on. It's coming out soon. But I never got that deep into it. Right about that time was when I was almost up into the point where I was writing so much at that point. I mean, at that point, and still now, I was up to 9 or 10 books a year would come out. I was just so busy. And the other funny thing is when you get older, I've heard this said about old guys, and it happened with movies too. I can't read fiction anymore. And I can't watch fiction movies. Everything I watch on TV is a documentary, and every book I read is a documentary. There's just something about I can't enter it's so weird when I turn on Netflix. I can't bring myself to click on an actual fiction movie. It's like I go to the documentary section, and I'm so ticked off at Netflix anyways, because it doesn't change often enough. And you scroll down that documentary thing, and there's so many of those I don't even want to see. Right?
Yeah.
But,
the Sons of Sam one is fascinating.
Oh, that was really good. I definitely watched that.
We don't want to get too far off astray here. This is a music podcast,
in fact,
but that's
if you want to get off for a little
stuff.
second, I put out a book called Flaming Telepaths.
Yeah.
Imaginos, Expanded and Specified. And it is a way down the rabbit hole, occult, strange, fictional thing where there's a lot of Crowley in it and Austin Osman Spare and H.P. Lovecraft, but also it touches upon the Process Church later on and Son of Sam and all this as we move through World War II, conspiracies, lots and lots of Rosicrucianism and alchemy. And it's this crazy timeline. And I drew 39 illustrations in this book. And I even got prints made of them and I'm selling them as prints and stuff. But this is a crazy, weird timeline book that's not even a music book. But when I watched the Sons of Sam thing, I went, oh man, a lot of this I kind of mentioned in the book. And it's like, this is freaky. Because I've been thinking of doing a second half, and the second half would have to touch a lot on, unfortunately, Hitler and the Nazis. So a lot of World War II stuff and Bell technology, a lot of UFOs and bikers and more cults, and a little bit of Son of Sam and stuff like that. And I thought, I don't know if I want to go do the second book because the first book is really dark already. Yeah. I don't know if I want to do a second one.
It could take over your whole life.
Yeah.
You don't want to get too attached to that stuff. It gets pretty dark. You do.
Well, that's exactly what that story was about, was a guy who just dedicated his whole life to trying to solve all that, right?
Yes. Oh, the Netflix documentary, right.
Yeah, I mean, the guy,
Maury,
Maury,
can't remember the last name.
Maury something.
You did put in your book the theme of Clockwork Angels. The theme of the album is, in a young man's quest to follow his dreams, he's caught between the grandiose forces of order and chaos. He travels across a lavish and colorful world of steampunk and alchemy, with lost cities, pirates, anarchists, exotic carnivals, and a rigid watchmaker who imposes precision on every aspect of daily life. Neil later wrote in the band's upcoming tour book, quote, "My friend Kevin J. Anderson was among the pioneers of a genre of science fiction that came to be called steampunk, a more romantic, idealistic reaction against the cyberpunk futurists with their scenarios of dehumanized, alienated, dystopian societies. Our own previous excursions into the future, 2112 and Red Barchetta, had been set in that darker kind of imagining for dramatic and allegorical effect. This time I was thinking of steampunk's definition as the future as it ought to have been, or the future as seen from the past, as imagined by Jules Verne and H.G. Wells in the late 19th century. Man, that's some heavy stuff from Neil Peart. Where do you place this final Rush album among all the others?
I'd say Vapor Trails is my favorite from the whole period covered in this book from the 90s to the end, but I would say Clockwork Angels would be second out of all those. I do like the way it kind of rocks, and it's, like I say, a little joyous, a more groovy, a little more traditional power trio about it. So it's a great way to end the career, and they finally did the concept album.
Your final chapter, titled In the End, begins with a quote, "Three young guys who grew up together in music and in life, going through everything music and life can throw at you." You begin with your thoughts on Rush getting into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2013 and your thoughts on the highly publicized speech, or lack of, from Alex Lifeson.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool that they got in, and I think it kind of changed things for the Rock Hall in terms of, I think they realized that if there is a groundswell revolt from the fans, it should be taken into account. The Rock Hall, they're people who are singer-songwriter, critics, fans. They're East Coast and West Coast. It's country rock. It's CBGBs. It's Detroit. What are all the things people like that hate the most? They hate progressive rock and they hate heavy metal, and Rush happens to be both. So like they're really swimming upstream to even get in. But it's pretty cool that they did get in. And I think even after Rush, it felt like the dam had burst a little and there were some better things going on. Like Deep Purple went in, and Yes, and Judas Priest got nominated twice, although they're not in, which is just a travesty. I think they're one of the biggest ones that I think should get in. I think for me now, it's Priest, Maiden, and Jethro Tull are the three biggest. I think there's the odd other one mentioned. That
you read my mind. I was going to mention Jethro Tull.
I've written these long articles for Goldmine on the whole reason Deep Purple should get in, and they got in. Yes, and they got in. And I did I thought a really good case for Judas Priest, and they got nominated, but they didn't get in twice. So that's pretty bizarre.
That makes no sense. Judas Priest is one of the...
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, there's about 20 reasons we could go into why they should be in, but no, it was cool that they got in. Alex's speech, I don't know, I think it went on a little long. The joke got a little too long, and after a while, you kind of wish he would have said something. And it also sounds a little bit too, you're in revolt against the Hall of Fame. You're kind of putting it down a little, so it sounded a little bit like that as well. like just the use of blah, blah, blah throughout the whole thing. But, I mean, he was kind of making a point how these speeches just usually in a lot of cases, very little gets said, right?
Where do you place Rush among the all-time greats in rock and roll? Like Zeppelin, the Beatles, the Stones, are they up there with those bands?
I think so, for quite a few different reasons. How long that catalog is, the whole business model. They really don't get enough credit for how incredible their show was and how many show innovations they did along the way, all that stuff they did with video and that. And the fact that they invented a genre, I totally believe that. And then other people joined them, but it took a long time, and there were very few bands along the way, as we discussed, who would dare sound like them, really, ever. So that's pretty cool about them as well. And that whole daring to be that literary and daring to be that note dense and do the tune tom fills and all that kind of thing. It might look in bad taste at the time or whatever, but when no one else is doing it, you are the only ones doing it. It turns out it was actually in good taste in a certain respect, or it took some bravery. And Neil being, I often call him like the Beatles of drummers, because he's writing hooks on drums that everybody remembers. He's the most air drum drummer of all time. So there are a lot of great reasons to put them up with those greats.
You've written a lot about Rush over the years, interviewed all three members. With Neil gone, Rush no more. Is this your final Rush book, or do you think there's still more to come?
Oh, I think it's definitely the final Rush book. I can't see doing any more on them. I've definitely said my piece. There's a lot of other bands I want to write on. Like I say, right now, I'm writing about one of my favorite bands of all time, The Damned. Just having a blast doing that one. That's one I've always wanted to get done. So
cool. Looking forward to that. Would you like to see a Rush movie made in the way they did with Queen and Freddie Mercury?
Not particularly. I never liked those biopics. I can never get it out of my head that guy who isn't that guy doesn't look exactly like that guy. And like I say, I've turned into such it's documentary or nothing for me. So I'm glad there's been 3 good Rush documentaries, I think, so far.
You were part of one of them.
Yeah, I think I might have been in 2 of them.
2 of
actually.
them? Okay.
Yeah. And then I worked on Beyond the Lighted Stage. I was on staff for 9 months.
That's the one I'm thinking of.
Oh, well, the other 2 I was like in a little bit. Actually, one of them I was in a lot. And then another one I was in a little bit. But Beyond the Lighted Stage, yeah, I worked in the office as research and part of the writing team somewhat.
Fans can get all 3 of these books, the usual Amazon.com, but you got your website, martinpopoff.com.
Yeah, and I do sign them all and send them out from here. And I've actually got some Rush bookmarks. I'm the only one with those. So I've got these bookmarks, and I sign them all. I ship them out of here. That's kind of my main way of making any money, is the buying and reselling of my own books. So yeah, martinpopoff.com. There's PayPal buttons there, the whole bit.
You got the ebooks. You got the podcast going.
And we've got the Contrarians YouTube show that we do very, very regularly as well. Yeah.
So that's on YouTube. Is there a YouTube channel people can look for it?
I think just put in the Contrarians and you'll find it all.
Yep. Okay.
We've done about 30, 40 different things so far.
And social media?
I'm good on Facebook, but I'm not good on anything else. I mean, I have Twitter. Twitter and me don't get along. But I love Facebook. I'm on there all the time. So I've got my regular page, my quote-unquote public person page. So I've got a page and a site, and then I also got a pretty active page for History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff.
Martin, thanks so much again for being on with me. I know you were on, like I said, about a handful of times on the old podcast. This is your first appearance on the Booked on Rock podcast.
Yes, thank you. And good luck with it.
Thank you so much, and we will talk to you soon, I'm sure.
Okay, sounds good.
Thanks to Martin Popoff for taking us through his book, Driven, Rush in the 90s and in the End. Be sure to subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find us online at bookedonrock.com, on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast, on Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact us through the website. If you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email or contact me through the website. I'm Eric Senich. Look forward to having you back again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.